like to begin by reading an abstract from that work. In the modern age of individualism, conservative concepts of loyalty have slipped into the background of the great conversation. While this may be true in the field of ethical philosophy, it's not true elsewhere. In this paper, I examine loyalty from the perspective of the folk and the philosopher, and found that each presents a valuable philosophical perspective. The status of loyalty as a virtue is disputed, especially by philosophers. It is observed that loyalty can be used in the commission of evil. It has also been denigrated as blindly emotional rather than rational. However, through my analysis, I conclude with rational argument and sympathy with the intuition that loyalty is virtuous. Loyalness is the quality or state of being loyal, the tendency towards loyalty. Loyalness is a virtue derived from reason, when properly incorporated into one's life, will lead to excellence. Loyalness is a character trait that helps a person to be about the world as a whole, by creating allegiances with objects of positive moral content. In addition, in the event of negative moral circumstances, a loyalty can be used to direct decisions in a consistent way. Loyalty is a way of making one larger than the finite limits of the self. Through good associations, one shares in the successes and defeats of the objects of loyalty. Loyalty must be tested both through adversity and critical reflection. Loyalty does not assume that a particular loyalty is costly, but it does imply that should a good loyalty become costly, a virtuous person will commit to the best interest of the object of loyalty, even at a disadvantage to the agent.
Quick clarification. Is loyalness and loyalty the same thing?
No.
Okay.
And we will discuss that at length. With these ideas in place, I make the following claim. Loyalty is a virtue. In order to make this claim, I must ask and answer a significant question. What is loyalty? Is it a virtue, and why? We can start by looking at some possible definitions. The first is the non-philosophical definition available in the OED, and another is in the SEP that reflects a more academic perspective. In the Oxford English Dictionary, giving or showing a firm and constant support or allegiance to a person or institution. That's the folk definition. And in the Standard Encyclopedia, loyalty can be characterized as a practical disposition to persist in an intrinsically valued, though not necessarily valuable, associational attachment where that involves a potentially costly commitment to secure, or at least not to jeopardize, the interests or well-being of the object of loyalty. Definitely much more technical. And this is the perspective that the primary philosopher that I cite, named John Kleinig, that he uses as his working definition. While most of you likely know what a virtue is conceptually, I present this short and wholly inadequate definition of virtue ethics. The definition includes statements that may be contentious but should have no negative effect on the argument. Virtue ethics is the normative ethical theory that emphasizes character. A virtue is a character trait or tendency that exemplifies the excellent, reasonable person working towards the maximization of personal potential, or eudaimonia. More important is the concept of the Aristotelian mean and its instrumental purpose towards recognizing and identifying virtues, which oddly enough was foreshadowed in the very last topic. In the Nicomachean ethics, Aristotle claimed that the common virtues were a balance between extremes. This is sometimes referred to as the golden or Aristotelian mean. It is seldom a perfect midpoint if such qualities can be quantified at all, but does provide us a useful tool for identifying virtues. To make things more clear, we should consider what is loyalty and what is not loyalty. Before we even begin, I want to emphasize a very important point. Loyalty, as in the trait of character, is not the same as the object of loyalty. In other words, loyalty is not patriotism, parenthood, marital fidelity, or any other descriptor that implies a specific target. More on this later, but this point will become extremely important when we start talking about individual philosophers and the folk. So what is loyalty at its base, and what is it not? Base loyalty is the psychological, some might even say genetic, predisposition to build associations that promote the best interest of the objects of loyalty. Non-loyalty is the tendency of those who antisocially lack the above-mentioned predispositions. This is technically morally neutral, but has an intuitive feel of deviant behavior. Loyalty can be morally neutral in its non-occurrent state. this is the sentimental state of loyalty. Sentimental loyalty is the tendency to form allegiances and remain steadfast in those allegiances without reflection, making them non-virtuous. They are often formed from societal or situational obligations with objects such as families, countries, and friends. This is loyalty in its morally neutral state. In other words, this is the loyalties that we don't think about, that we just go through our day-to-day lives, we take care of our kids, we honor our countries, we do these kinds of things without really putting them to test, so we don't critically reflect on them. By definition, that's not a virtue. A virtue has to be morally reflected upon. So, as long as these sentimental loyalties are not held towards evil ends, then they hold no moral value, even if they're towards very good objects. In order to understand loyalty, what might be useful for us is to look at the more recognized trait of courage. Courage is commonly recognized, or is a commonly recognized Aristotelian virtue that leads in part to the excellence of character. Courage can be virtuous when it is applied in the right way. That is, the necessary practical reason is practiced as required in order for it to be virtuous. So loyalty is like courage in that it is virtuous even though it can be used to conduct oneself evilly. It is not courage at fault for the evil, it's the poor character of the agent that's at fault. And we'll discuss that a little bit more if time permits. So how do we make loyalty a virtue? First, we have to recognize the extremes and the virtuous states of the tendency. I call these aspects of loyalty, and they are the vice of complacency, the vice of disloyalty, and the virtuous loyalness. This is where loyalness comes back into play. Complacency is the tendency to make allegiances, and then upon reflection, discovering that some of those loyalties are morally negative, remain loyal out of a sense of obligation or laziness. Complacency is morally negative and vicious. Disloyalty is the tendency to make loyalties and not maintain them, or without reflection, or to exploit them for one's own interest. So these sentimental loyalties, which are morally neutral, suddenly become available to you as an occurrent state of reflection. So I see that my country is conducting themselves in this particular way. I think about that, and rather than forfeit my loyalty, I maintain that loyalty out of a sense of obligation, even though I know that what they're doing is evil. So they become morally negative. Disloyalty is morally negative and vicious. The aspect that lies between these two extremes is the tendency to reflect on the moral content of loyalties as they become occurrent, maintaining those with positive moral content and forfeiting those that are evil. The thesis, when so well defined, seems to lack contention. So what really is the problem? That was my graphic for you guys. Enjoy. There's no more. It comes down to understanding connotation. The common understanding considers loyalty from some difficult points of view. Consistency is important, so I will quickly discuss 2 points of view. The view of the folk that was gathered through interview and open forum, and the other form is technical philosophical perspective. So I'd like to discuss the folk for a few minutes. I'm going to deviate from my cards so I can address each of these. So originally defined, loyalty was simply a way of defining how one acted towards their sovereign. So there was no mutuality, there was no downward flowing loyalty. There was only how one conducted themselves according to law based on their sovereign's demands. It's a problematic start for loyalty because we have a very different conception of that now. So if we try to go into the etymology, we run into some trouble. Furthermore, in these interviews, when I was gathering this information, one of the things that I found was that loyalty is usually a loyalty of or a virtue of judgment. In other words, it's something we expect of others. I don't worry about how loyal I am to others when I'm telling you how much of a virtue it is. I'm worried about how much loyalty you show to me. So if you show me a lot of loyalty, then I'm going to think you're a virtuous person. But it doesn't have anything to do with whether you're virtuous towards other people, even though you've betrayed me in some way or something like that. So there's this problem that we run into where the focus of the character is external instead of internal. And then on top of that, the final problem with the folk is this reputation for loyalty is actually equally valued to actual being loyal. So I'm going to judge someone as loyal or not loyal based on their reputation for loyalty, not for any particular loyalty that they've shown to me. The philosopher, on the other hand, makes so much more technical distinctions, but they run into a similar number of problems. For instance, one of the major problems is that the psychological predisposition has been shown to have some genetic trait to it. If it's genetic like that, well then it can't be a virtue because it's just instinct. It's not something that we can cultivate into a particular reason. While it's still good, and while it's still a positive trait, and all of these other kinds of things, it's not virtuous because it doesn't. You can't cultivate it into this habit. It's already there. The other problem is mutuality. In order for loyalty to be complete, there has to be a loyalty from and a loyalty to from the same object. I think that's an unfair requirement. You can hold loyalties to all kinds of objects without having to require anything back from them. There's the exclusionary rule, which is that in order to hold a loyalty, I have to hold it at the expense of something else. So if I'm going to be loyal to you, I can't be loyal to the other. Value and forfeiture. There's the problem with being able to forfeit loyalties. Is that a positive trait or not? Vices associated with loyalty often get mixed in. So if complacency, for my argument, if complacency is the ultimate expression of loyalty in its extreme, do we allow for that to be part of the virtuous conversation, or can we allow for it to be a vice? And then loyalty to causes. This is Josiah Royce, who wrote a very expansive treatise on loyalty. His idea was that we can't be loyal to earthly things. We have to be loyal to these grand causes that extend past our lives. Very interesting view. Unfortunately, it has nothing in common with any common perspective of loyalty. Anything that is generally considered loyalty, it's just a complete redefinition of the word. Like I said, it's a good view. I like it. It just doesn't fit loyalty as we think of it. And then the biggest problem, and this is the primary objection to loyalty as a virtue, is what I call the object problem. The object problem is the issue that the character trait becomes confused with particular objects of the character trait. This is a categorical error. So the categorical error implies that when we start talking about loyalty, we get stuck on what our loyalty is towards, rather than whether I am a loyal person or not. So I can cultivate my loyalty to any number of objects. Some of those objects may have good moral content or negative moral content. None of that matters. It's whether I am a loyal person and I remain steadfast in my loyalties, that I reflect on my loyalties and forfeit those that have negative moral content. So the category issue becomes a point of contention when we start talking about things like, well, if you're loyal to your country and your country does an evil thing, that makes you an evil person. Not directly. You have to reflect on that, and you can still hold loyalties to a number of good objects, and that one negative object may not necessarily ruin your possibility for excellence. To bring all this to life, I introduce us to our good friend Wilhelm. So Wilhelm is a young man, a soldier, who has lived his entire life as a loyal subject to his country and his political party. Wilhelm finds himself suddenly captured by an enemy. He is imprisoned, but does not break under interrogation, all the while suffering horrible tortures. The intuition is that Wilhelm is a loyal, virtuous person. There's a twist, though. The party was utterly destroyed during Wilhelm's imprisonment. Interviewees still sided with Wilhelm as a virtuous person due to his steadfastness. It was reported that it wasn't the object of Wilhelm's loyalty that made him virtuous, but the fact that he was a loyal person. The folk conclude that Wilhelm is not only loyal, but also that his loyalty is a trait of good character. In short, interviewees judge Wilhelm as a good person based on the story of his loyalty to his faction. So overall, Wilhelm seems to be a pretty good guy, but Wilhelm is a Nazi. His loyalty to his party has been evidenced through his career via the willful genocide of fellow Germans based on nothing other than their ethnic designation. He knows that his actions are heinous, but does not question what is asked of him in the name of his party. His loyalty is so strong that he willingly sets aside any other morality, following the strictures of the Nazis as closely and dogmatically as possible. From this perspective, Wilhelm is an evil person, and therefore cannot be virtuous. Can I claim loyalty for the side of virtue if this blatant example of evil character can hold such a trait? This seems to be a problem. So here's where Wilhelm fails. Wilhelm doesn't threaten loyalty. As we saw with the courage analogy, one can hold many virtues and still fail to achieve excellence. Even in those cases where the virtue is maximized, without pursuit of good character, one can never achieve eudaimonia. So you can have all the virtues you want. If you're not actively pursuing good character through the cultivation of those virtues for the sake of eudaimonia, you're not being virtuous. You're never going to be good. It is further the case that a virtue used evilly does not constitute the virtuousness of a trait. Courage is still a virtue even after a man braves the police to commit a daring bank robbery. Fortitude is still a virtue even if a man barricades himself in a bunker with his hostages for weeks. It is how the virtues are exercised using one's practical reason that leads to the eudaimonia. So, in summary, loyalty is a trait of character. It's not the object of our loyalty. Loyalty is not a single atomic trait, but instead a trait made of boundary concepts with shades of gray in between, some of which can be vicious. Loyalness is the virtuous aspect of the trait and can lead to excellence. Loyalty is a virtue. So there's a couple of things that I wanted to get through the slides first, but I want to go a little more in depth on, and specifically in regards to the problem of virtue in regards to the categorical error. The whole power of virtue theory is the ability to internalize your ability to be good or evil. So through introspection alone, you can be good without relying on the external world to provide you the perfect circumstances to be good. So if I am a loyal person, or to go with the talk earlier, if I'm a loving person, it doesn't matter what I love, it's that I'm a loving person that makes it virtuous or not. It's the fact that I'm loyal that makes it virtuous or not that I'm loyal to any specific objects. But I have to do so in the pursuit of being a good person. I have to want to be a good person. So there's the initial motivation. The praiseworthiness of the difficulty of temptation, of virtues, in the Aristotelian view, actually reduces. As you practice your virtues and as you become better at them, they become less difficult. It becomes easier to be fortuitous, or it becomes easier to be loyal without having to make that recurrent choice each time. So as I become a better loyal person, then I'm going to choose loyalties, individual loyalties, that are more likely to have positive moral content. But that positive moral content isn't what constitutes a virtue or not. It just means my decisions are getting better. I'm having less trouble deciding which ones are which. And it allows us to cultivate that eudaimonia by not having to worry about each individual virtue, each one conglomerating into one giant master virtue of practical reason and the seeking of eudaimonia. So that's pretty much all I've got for this particular extract. I would love to have comments. Any questions?